Earlier this year, she became the first woman from the Global South to head philanthropist George Soros's Open Society Foundations and set about deepening efforts to make the organization truly global. Kenyan lawyer Binaifer Nowrojee, president of Open Society Foundations, joins us now to talk about transformation in the 31-year-old institution, where it's headed, and to reflect on South Africa in the global mix when it comes to BRICS and its presidency of the G20 come December the 1st. Binaifer, good morning. Welcome to the program. Lovely to have you with us. Just over 6 months into your term, but 20 years at the foundation, I understand, so you know it really well. There have been some serious changes and transformation efforts at the foundation. What was that about, and are things stable now?
So the world that we were set up in, about 40 years ago is a different world to today. So today, what we see is really backsliding and the rise of authoritarianism. You see proliferating conflicts, divisions in societies. Essentially, the way we were set up with national offices, including in South Africa, just is not able to knit up into something global to make us more than the sum of our parts. So we've changed and transformed, but still a heavy commitment to promoting human rights, justice, equity in South Africa. So South Africa is where actually Open Society Foundations began. In 1979, George Soros's first act of philanthropy was to fund scholarships for Black students at the University of Cape Town. And we've had an office since then in Cape Town and in Johannesburg, which we'll retain. So it's just the nature of the work and how we'll work will be different in the same way that we are seeing the situation in South Africa evolve in different ways and the issues shifting.
And we'll come back to some of those shifting issues in South Africa when it comes to governance in South Africa and society. You talked there about South Africa being the place where George Soros began his philanthropic work, supporting Black students with scholarships. During this transformation period, though, the perception is that South Africa has been particularly affected by the closure of its national foundation and then some significant funding cuts. What's the story there and the future of funding?
Okay. So the operating model that we have is changing, meaning that we went from 40 offices around the world to 14. The funds and the amount of administrative burden to actually run 40 offices takes away funds and time, etc. So we've moved to one office in South Africa, in Johannesburg. The budget of Open Society remains the same. We're a $1.2 billion annual organization. And our mandate remains the same. We're still promoting human rights, equity, justice, and we're beginning to look at what our new strategies are. So I can speak a little bit on South Africa just now, on what we're looking at, but we've already restarted the work. And I think that there shouldn't be fears that, that Open Society is in any way abandoning South Africa.
So what are some of the immediate priorities you are setting? You hinted at some for South Africa. We can even start from a more continental perspective, because you talked about making it lean. You talked about it being more focused and global. Just share with us a little more detail on scope for Africa and your operations.
Sure. I think this is a moment in the world where we can see that the global economic system is not working for everyone, and that actually there's widening inequality. There's growing debt and poverty in a lot of countries, particularly in Africa. And what we see is that, the face of poverty is predominantly it's Black or female. And so Open Societies is moving into doing more on economic and social rights. So if I can just very quickly speak about one of the first things I did under my leadership when I came in, we've approved a $400 million commitment around promoting new economic models that can make sure that there's inclusion in the way governments actually promote their economic policies, and that we move to clean energy. And this is clearly a huge issue for South Africa. Additionally, we want to make sure that societies have inclusion. What we're seeing is even democracies becoming more exclusionary. And so we want to ensure that we are committing to the issues of gender, of race. We've just done a $25 million commitment to promote women in political participation and to help build a pipeline of women politicians to assist and support them, but more importantly, to keep them. What we're finding is that women politicians after the first term, because it's so tough, actually drop out and don't remain in politics. So we're seeing ourselves both in economic, social, and political and civil and political rights arenas.
Well, let's talk about the just energy transition. I know that this is something that's close to your heart and close to the heart of the organization. You spoke about the $400 million of new, of the way that you would fund in an inclusive way. For people who are listening, who are watching, who are thinking, well, I would like to be, part of that beneficiary system. I would love to be a part of, especially in terms of developing green energy models and inclusion. How do they get involved? How do they credibly approach the organization and get some of that funding?
Okay, so we know that South Africa is at a critical crossroads, particularly around energy. So what South Africa has is 90,000 jobs tied to the coal economy, and 61% of the coal belt communities dependent on this coal value chain. And so the stakes to move to green energy is really high for South Africa. And I have to say, it's really heartening to see that the government is making an effort around the just energy transition that is a once-in-a-generation chance to reshape South Africa's energy landscape. So we just finished a high-level convening with the government, with UNDP, and our funds will help to go into supporting and assisting new economic thinking that can help us to move. Because economies like South Africa that are dependent on coal, you can't just stop. The economy will collapse. What we need is a plan that moves us to renewables in a staggered and time-bound way, but also makes sure that the jobs we're creating are the relevant jobs. It's not enough just to have jobs if they're in the wrong sector or the economy can't absorb them. It's not enough. And to ensure that the people on the edges of society, particularly the communities most affected by climate change, are the ones that we are lifting as we move to clean energy.
True, and the ones who get a seat, at the table in discussing their fate and what the nature of, interventions or help are going to be like with their inclusion. Binaifer, South Africa plays an influential role on the continent as well as globally through the G20 and our position on the war Israel is waging on Gaza. Will Open Society Foundation support South Africa as a regional and global leader?
So what we are very heartened by some of the efforts around the African Union to build cross-continental connections so that African states are working together. We're also seeing in this changing world a rise of South-South connections and connectivity. So some of our programming is now trying to connect Latin America, Asia, Africa around similar issues of concern. So to play that connective tissue role to bring together efforts around a variety of issues around human rights. And what we see also is the global economic systems not working for everyone, but we see the beginning with BRICS. We see it with South Africa and Africa joining the G20. We see a different strain of voices coming in and actually a chance to really rethink. At the end of the Second World War, there were creative and imaginative thinkers that brought us the Bretton Woods institutions, that helped create the United Nations mechanisms. Now we see 50 years later, those systems, we see the weaknesses of those, and we need people with the moral imagination in this world to think about how we actually can do something that is inclusive and that puts the humanity of all of us at the forefront so that we can all thrive. And I see actually South Africa and Africa in that effort very strongly.
Yeah, I mean, it is a good opportunity. The consensus is, Binaifer, for us to shape the debate, to bring that African perspective and to widen the aperture of how Africa is viewed just overall. We have to begin to step up and raise the volume on our voices. Speaking of change, we are in a GNU process. Well, that's the term we're going with. There's some debate, Binaifer, you must know, and I'm sure you do already, about whether this is a grand coalition or whether it is a truly government of a national unity. Whatever the case is, and you'll see on a day like today, where we're talking about a medium-term budget, is how the aspirations of all of the different groups represented in that GNU are then expressed through the budget and the different priorities that the different parties have. You talked about democratic backsliding in different parts of the world. Just your thoughts on the complementarity of organizations like yourselves to the government of this type of formation in South Africa right now. Do you see any, and what is your perspective on the route South Africa is now going politically?
So I must say, I mean, everybody, I think, had concerns how the election would come out and worries about what a coalition government would do. But I have to say, at least in these early days, what I see, and it's still, still early, is an effort on the part of coalition partners to actually move things forward. And what it does say is that South Africa's political scaffolding has held, and it's not necessarily only a single party that can carry the nation. I'm not saying it's easy, and clearly there's lots of differences and splinters, but the fact that all the coalition members have come together with a will to make this work, I think is really admirable. Because the alternative, actually, it's not good. When you begin to have a breakdown of a kind of pluralist environment politically, it does lead to what we're seeing, which is sort of a hyper majoritarianism in places around the world that is worrying. And so, fingers crossed, this GNU or coalition government can continue to keep South African citizens at the forefront of their efforts.
I know fun might be a bit far-fetched, but are you having a good time? Are you enjoying your 6 months in and optimistic for what's to come, Binaifer?
I think, when you work in the area of human rights, you have to be a professional optimist. And so even though there's lots of, bad news you can pick up around the world, I must say that I do feel that there's new areas of hope, new areas of opportunity that we're seeing. I certainly see South Africa as a key and growing player in the world in terms of moving us in the right direction. And in particular, I see South Africa as being a member not just of Africa, but really global. We see it with G20. We see it also in South Africa's role in terms of bringing the case against violations in Israel-Gaza at the International Criminal Court, ICJ, International Court of Justice. So I'm actually quite heartened to see the beginnings of workings between civil society, government, and corporations to make this a better world. I think really the challenge for us now, as this inequality gap widens, is for us to ensure that we carry people with us, that all of us are lifted. In that regard, I'm optimistic. Fun, I don't know yet. It's still a lot. I'm still finding my feet, and so it's hard work, but there's nothing better than work that you're committed to and you have a passion for.
Yeah, speaking about professional optimism, someone said you shouldn't ask if the glass is half full or half empty. You should just say, we're happy to have a glass. So Binaifer Nowrojee, thank you very much for talking to us.